In the autumn woods of Missouri's Ozarks, former Marine John Carter and his German Shepherd Rex stumbled upon something no hunter's trail should reveal: a rusted armored truck buried deep in a ravine. Inside lay two skeletons' shell casings and a secret that the entire town of Harmony Creek had spent decades burying. What John uncovered would not only endanger his life but force a powerful man's long-hidden crimes into the light. Stay with us and don't forget to like this story and subscribe for more tales of loyalty, betrayal, and justice. The Ozarks in late autumn wore their quiet, like a veteran wears an old jacket, faded at the seams, durable where it counts. John Carter had come here for that kind of quiet, the kind that lets a man's breathing slow and his thoughts stop marching. The morning after a hard storm, the forest smelled of wet leaves and iron-rich clay. He stepped from his cabin into air as cool as spring water boots, sinking just enough for the mud to hold his print. Beside him padded Rex, a German shepherd with a steel-gray saddle and sharp ears that counted every sound twice. They followed a deer path toward the ridge where last night's rain had laced the creek with silt the color of coffee. John's shoulder still remembered the weight of a pack, though these days his pack held a thermos and a small first-aid roll instead of mission gear. He walked like a Marine, still measuring horizons and exits, not because danger was near, but because the habit had followed him home and never left. The wind threaded through sycamores left its signature in a faint rattle of seed pods lifted and fell again like breath. He found reassurance in simple things: the grip of dry bark, the hush after a woodpecker quits a tree, the sturdy presence of Rex pressing his flank to John's knee at tight turns. They reached the washed-out bend of the creek where the bank had slumped overnight and peeled away like a torn page. The slope now raw and slick exposed roots like ropes and a seam of unfamiliar gray cutting across the brown clay. John slowed. Rex stopped dead. The dog's hackles rose as if a cold hand brushed them. John raised his palm. "Easy," he said, but his voice had a grit he hadn't planned. He could taste metal in the air, a damp, flat tang that belonged inside a garage, not beneath a hill. The gray wasn't rock. It was a plane of steel pitted and filmed with reddish bloom where it met the clay as though the earth had spent years trying to swallow it and failed. An arm-length run of rivets showed along one edge. A seam ran perpendicular, tight, straight, honest in a way the woods rarely were. John crouched a few feet above the thing and touched mud to check stability. The slope held. He set his gloves and swiped a sleeve over the steel. Grit hissed. Beneath the skin of mud lay that dull, purposeful metal, the kind you build when you expect trouble to come. Rex let out a low, sustained growl, not threat, not show, but warning. The sound rippled through John's ribs. He scanned the tree line without moving his head, let his eyes sweep for color, shape, movement. Nothing. No boot prints near the new cut. No smoke. Only a hawk drawing slow circles, measuring the ground with its shadow. John's breath came steady again. "I hear you," he said to Rex. "We go slow." He didn't carry a crowbar on a morning walk, but he carried enough memory to improvise. He stepped back to a downed limb and snapped off a length, shaved it with a folder knife until the end spat clean wood. He eased down, wedged the stick into the seam, and leaned in. The wood flexed and creaked like an old chair. The seam did not budge. The steel had been set here for keeps. He pulled the stick free and tapped along the exposed edge, ear tuned to the difference between dirt on steel and dirt on dirt. The tone came back muted, solid, a closed-throat thud. He didn't need to open it today. He needed to understand it. The angle suggested a curved roofline rather than a flat deck, a bowed crown like the turtles that hauled themselves onto creek banks to take the sun. He pictured dimensions without meaning to roughly 8 feet across, where visible the edge curves suggest a boxy hull. He had seen roofs like this through dust and cry of sirens in other lives' armored bodies baked beneath desert glare, square windows like narrow eyes. He put that image in a quiet corner of his mind and kept working the facts. The creek runs west to east. The slump pointed south. If the storm peeled this much more, lay buried uphill. He planted his boots and dug with his hands, pulling away shelves of slick clay, then using his knife to saw a stubborn root fat as a thumb. He worked clean and methodically until the seam showed another foot, enough for shapes to emerge where flat had suggested flat. Along the seam he found the remnant of a hinge swollen with rust, heavy under knotted dirt, the color of old blood. Hinge meant door. Door meant a chamber beneath. He stopped. The dog's breathing had changed. Quiet held watching without sound. John laid his palm flat on the cold steel, felt the chill push through the leather of his glove, and counted a heartbeat from the metal that wasn't his own, a phantom rhythm born of memory. He had opened doors that shouldn't be opened a world away, and learned to wait for the second beat, the beat where patience saves you. He wiped the dirt from his knuckles, capped his knife, and stood. "We mark it and come back," he told Rex. "Not a cowboy show." He scanned for reference 3 birches in a staggered line, a limestone shelf like a broken grin, a scar where lightning had split an oak and left it silver as a gravestone. He took out a pencil stub and drew a simple working map on the back of a grocery receipt, naming features the way Marines name fields of fire. The ridge they called Hump. The slumped bank they called Scar. The steel he labeled simply Roof. He tucked the receipt into his wallet behind the faded card that said United States Marine Corps, and the photo of a younger man with a crew cut and sunburned, laugh lines a man he tried to remember kindly. As they climbed out of the ravine, the forest resumed its ordinary life. Squirrels resumed their bickering. A train whispered somewhere distant, a thin ribbon of sound that only arrives when leaves are wet. John's mind measured needs and timing. He'd need a proper bar, maybe a come-along rope a block to heel in as a stop. He'd move with respect, anchoring lines, setting chocks, because the earth can betray you without warning, and steel can turn sudden when its tension breaks. He'd need to tell someone. He considered the sheriff's office, thought of the shrug he had once received after reporting a poached deer on public land, thought of the way certain doors close when you lean on them without leverage. He shelved that step. He told himself it was prudence, not distrust, and kept walking. Back at the cabin, the world shrank to familiar comforts. The kettle set on the propane burner, steam rising with a soft breath. Rex circling the woven rug once, twice, then settling with a sigh at the door. The faint knock of an autumn fly against the window that looked toward the ridge. John poured coffee black, sat at the table he had built from oak planks salvaged from a barn older than he was, and laid out a clean page from a yellow legal pad. He wrote in a block hand numbers down the left margin, words on the right, like orders pinned to a board. He listed what he needed. He listed the time he would return, the weather conditions. He would prefer the dangers he expected: slope instability, possible trapped air, wildlife bedding in the wash. He wrote what he hoped not to find and what he was ready to accept if he did. Under the list he wrote a sentence he had never written before. If it is what I think it is, then somebody will miss it and somebody will guard the missing. He let the kettle whistle once before he turned the flame down and filled a second mug to cool. Old habits keep you honest. He packed a day bag, first aid kit, headlamp, flagging tape, a coil of paracord, a folded tarp to lie on if it rained again. He set the crowbar on the counter and stood looking at it the way a man looks at a decision. Through the window, the ridge's shadow lengthened, and for the first time that day he felt the wood's attention on him. The hush that isn't weather or birds. The hush that gathers around a thing about to be remembered. Rex stirred and patted over, rested his chin on John's thigh. The dog's eyes were steady, an old friend's judgment that never scolded and never lied. John rested a hand on the broad head and let his voice settle. "We go at first light," he said. "We do it right." For a long moment he sat still. He listened to the stove's tiny clicks as metal cooled, to Rex's even breathing, to the wind smudging against the cabin's eaves. He pictured the seam again, the purposeful line, the stubborn hinge, and the way the earth had fought for years to keep its secret. He did not picture what lay inside. A Marine learns to separate anticipation from preparation, hope from plan. He let the separation stand. He rose, checked the back door, the windows, the truck, not out of fear, because order gives a man a place to stand when the ground shifts. Clouds moved in from the west like a gray parade, low and patient. Somewhere beyond the ridge, the creek kept rewriting its banks. John shut off the lights. The room folded into shapes his hands knew by memory. Rex found his spot by the door again, the sentinel who slept with one ear awake. John lay down, and somewhere between his last waking thought and the first flicker of sleep, he realized that tomorrow might not be as quiet as today had been. He did not resent the thought. He accepted it the way he'd once accepted orders. Head up, eyes open, boots laced. The woods breathe. The steel waits. Morning would have its say. John Carter returned to the ravine at first light, the crowbar slung over his shoulder like a relic from a different kind of war. Rex padded at his side, steady and silent, his nose twitching as he read the morning air. The bank was still raw from the storm, the scar in the earth darker than the surrounding soil, as though the land itself wanted to keep its secret hidden. John set down his pack, tested the slope with his boots, then lowered himself carefully until he was once again in front of the curved roof of steel. The crowbar's cold weight felt like both tool and weapon, a reminder that curiosity sometimes called for strength. He wedged the bar into the rusted seam he had found the day before, leaned his body into it, and listened as the earth itself seemed to groan in protest. At first, nothing happened. Then, with a slow, tortured creak, the hinge surrendered, sending a shower of rust flakes down the slope. A breath of air rushed out from within, not the cool freshness of the forest, but a foul and clinging stench that struck him like a blow. It was the smell of time sealed too long of decay, trapped where it could not escape, a reminder that the earth does not forget. Rex barked once, sharp and unsettled, before dropping back into a low growl. John tightened his grip on the crowbar, forced the seam wider, and pulled the door enough to let his flashlight cut through the black. What the beam revealed made his pulse slow to a deliberate cadence. 2 skeletal forms sat upright in the cab, their bones draped with fragments of cloth too ragged to name as uniform or suit. One skull rested against the driver's headrest, tilted as if watching the years pass by. The other slumped forward, jaw open in a silent cry. Around their feet lay a scatter of brass casings dulled by rust, each one a frozen echo of violence. On the floor between the seats was the twisted frame of what once had been a shotgun, its barrel warped with age, its purpose long spent. John took a long breath through his mouth, tasting copper in the air, and forced himself to study rather than recoil. He noted the position of the casings, the angle of the bones, the fact that neither door had been forced from the outside. Whatever had happened had taken place in this cabin of steel, a fight ending in silence, locked away by mud and time. He took photographs with his small digital camera, his hand steady, though his mind raced. He had documented enough in his past life to know the value of careful record. When he had finished, he eased the door closed again, leaving the steel tomb sealed but not forgotten. Climbing back up the bank, he felt Rex press close, the dog's eyes dark with concern. John rubbed his ears and spoke low, more for himself than the animal. "We saw it. Now we know." The drive to town was quiet, the old Ford truck humming steady as he watched the road unwind through the woods. Harmony Creek lay nestled in the valley like a postcard that had faded at the edges. Its single main street bore brick buildings with painted signs that looked older than most of the folks who walked beneath them. John parked near the sheriff's office, a squat structure with a flag that moved listlessly in the breeze. Inside the front desk, officer looked up from a newspaper. His badge shone against a uniform that was pressed but weary. John explained what he had found, his words measured and precise, every detail offered in order. He expected questions, the kind that press for clarity, but instead he received a silence that stretched too long. The officer exchanged a glance with another man in the back office before giving John a smile that did not reach his eyes. "That area floods often," the officer said in a tone meant to close doors rather than open them. "What you found has probably been there a long time. Nothing to concern yourself with." John held his ground. 2 skeletons in the cab of an armored truck are not nothing. The officer's smile thinned. "The past has a way of staying where it belongs. My advice? Leave it there. Don't stir up ghosts that don't need stirring." John felt the familiar tightening of his jaw, the instinctive reaction when an order disguised as advice pressed against his sense of duty. He did not raise his voice, did not argue, but he recognized dismissal when he heard it. They would not file a report, would not send deputies to the ravine. The message was clear. Step back. He left the office with the weight of unfinished duty heavy in his chest. Outside, the town looked the same, but the air felt different, as if every window curtain watched his back. Rex walked close to his leg, sensing the unease. John drove past the diner, past the hardware store, past faces that seemed too quick to look away. The world here had chosen silence, and silence was often the cloak of guilt. Back at the cabin, he unloaded his gear, set the crowbar against the wall, and sat at his table with the yellow legal pad once more. He wrote down the officer's words, word for word, because memory can blur when anger intrudes. He underlined the phrase, "Leave it there," and circled the word ghosts. He knew then that he had stepped onto ground where others had already walked, and that those others had left signs meant to warn him away. He sipped his coffee, its bitterness grounding him, and looked across the room at Rex. The dog's steady gaze reminded him of something he had learned long ago. Silence in the wrong place is as dangerous as gunfire. He thought of the casings, the bones, the sealed steel cabin, and the refusal of the sheriff's office to lift a pen. He knew that ignoring the find would not erase it. The storm had uncovered the past, and now it had uncovered him with it. He closed the notebook, leaned back in his chair, and stared at the rafters. Somewhere beyond those beams lay a night sky that carried no answers, only reminders. The woods waited, the truck waited, and so did the truth. He would not wait forever. The next morning, John Carter woke with the unease of unfinished duty pressing on his chest. The sheriff's dismissal had not erased what he had seen inside the armored truck. If anything, the refusal to act had carved the truth deeper into his mind. He made coffee strong enough to brace against the chill fed Rex, and packed a notebook, pencil, and camera into his bag. His truck hummed down the valley road, the tires humming against gravel until the pavement began. He drove toward Harmony Creek's library, a modest brick building whose front steps were worn by years of shoes, but whose windows shone as if they still expected visitors to believe in learning. Inside, the air smelled of paper floor polish and the faint sweetness of dust that had settled decades ago. Behind the desk sat a woman with silver hair pulled into a bun. Her reading glasses perched low, her eyes sharp as though she measured the worth of each question before answering. John asked for newspapers from the late 1980s. She studied him for a long moment, then nodded and led him to the microfilm reader in a corner where the light was dim and the hum of the machine filled the silence like a low heartbeat. He loaded the reel hand steady from years of habit and began to scroll through the headlines. At first, the stories were ordinary small-town concerns, harvest festivals, high school football town council meetings. Then, in September of 1987, a headline stopped him. "Cold armored truck disappears en route to Federal Reserve branch." He leaned closer, scanning each word. The article explained that a Brinks armored vehicle carrying nearly $5 million in cash had vanished while traveling between a regional bank in Springfield and a federal depository. The truck's last known location had been somewhere near Harmony Creek after a routine radio check with dispatch. The names of 2 guards were listed, both men with families in nearby counties. Search efforts had been immediate and massive, with state police and even federal agents establishing roadblocks and combing through back roads. The article carried photographs of the missing men in black and white, their smiles now frozen in time. The more John read, the more his throat tightened. The truck he had found could only be this one. He scrolled further, following the coverage as days turned into weeks. The first week was a storm of attention headlines, on every front page reporters speculating about hijacking, betrayal, or professional thieves. Then the second week carried fewer details, only vague mentions of ongoing searches and dead ends. By the third week, the story had been pushed deeper into the pages, overshadowed by politics and sports. By the fourth, the coverage vanished altogether, replaced by recipes and weather reports. He scrolled back and forth looking for follow-up statements, anything. It was as if the entire case had been swallowed whole. He rubbed his jaw, listening to the steady hum of the machine, and wrote notes in his pad: dates, amounts, names, sequence of events. He underlined the point where coverage had abruptly ceased. Cases like this did not simply fade. They were either solved or buried. The silence spoke louder than any headline. He shut down the reel and walked to the desk. The librarian looked up, her eyes careful. "Find what you were looking for?" she asked. John held her gaze. Enough to know that people stopped looking. She pursed her lips, then leaned forward just enough to lower her voice. "Not everything makes it to the papers," she said. "Sometimes the story is larger than the town that holds it." He thanked her, returned the reels, and stepped into the sunlight outside. The air carried the smell of cut grass and exhaust from an old pickup parked down the block. Townsfolk moved about their business, but John noticed how easily they glanced away when their eyes met his. The pattern had repeated silence where questions should have been. Driving back toward his cabin, he reviewed the facts in his head, organizing them the way he once organized field reports. An armored truck vanished in 1987, carrying a fortune. 2 guards disappeared with it. For 3 weeks, the state searched. Then, suddenly, interest died, as if ordered to. 30 years later, a storm exposed part of the truck with 2 skeletons still inside. The sheriff's office refused to act, steering him away with empty words. He tapped the steering wheel as he drove, the rhythm of his thoughts building. If the past had been buried, someone had buried it deliberately. Money of that size did not simply vanish, nor did the men who carried it. Someone had profited. Someone had silenced. And someone had ensured the community's lips stayed sealed. By the time he reached his cabin, dusk had set, and the woods had folded into shades of deep green and gray. He parked, stepped out, and let Rex run a short circle before settling near the porch. John sat on the steps with his notebook open across his knees. He drew a timeline marking the disappearance, the press coverage, and the sudden end. He circled the year 1987 and drew an arrow forward to the storm that had revealed the truck. He wrote in steady block letters, "The past was forced underground. Now it has surfaced." He knew the next step was to determine who had the power to bury it. The names of the guards offered one path: families left behind, perhaps still waiting. The other path led to those who had investigated and then walked away. He closed the notebook and slipped it into his jacket. The forest was hushed, but the silence no longer felt protective. It felt watchful, as though the trees themselves were holding on to secrets too heavy to let go. Rex lifted his head, ears, twitching eyes fixed on the tree line. John followed the gaze, saw nothing but felt the prickle of being observed. He rose, slowly checked the door locks, and stepped inside with the dog at his heel. He lit a lamp, the warm glow casting long shadows, and sat again at the oak table. His path forward was set. He would not let a story of blood and money be erased by time or by silence. The woods had spoken once by giving up the steel. He would make them speak again. The following afternoon, John Carter steered his truck into the center of Harmony Creek. The library had given him facts, but facts without voices were like maps without legends. He needed to hear the living memory of the town, the kind spoken over coffee and pie, the kind that reveals more in silence than in words. The Creekside Diner stood near the corner of Main, its red neon sign flickering faintly in the daylight, its front windows fogged by steam rising from the kitchen. John pushed through the door, and the brass bell above gave a polite jingle. Inside, the air was rich with the smell of bacon grease brewed coffee and the faint tang of cleaning powder. He took a booth near the window where Rex could wait outside in view, resting on his haunches beside the truck. A waitress with tired eyes and a gentle smile approached her pen poised. "Coffee and a slice of apple pie, please," John said, offering the kind of order that sounded ordinary. She nodded, poured from the pot she carried, and left him to his thoughts. The counter held 3 older men in work clothes, their voices low, their laughter easy until John cleared his throat. He leaned slightly across the table and spoke in a tone designed to sound casual. "I've been reading up on Old Town history," he said. "Back in 1987, something about an armored truck gone missing around here. That must have been a story folks remembered." The words hung in the air like smoke. The men's laughter stopped mid-breath. The forks of 2 women in a corner booth paused halfway to their mouths. Even the waitress hesitated, coffee pot still in hand. The silence deepened heavy as snow. One man at the counter cleared his throat and stared into his mug. Another shifted on the stool, his shoulders stiff. No one met John's eyes. He tried again, softer. 2 guards disappeared too. That must have shaken a town this size. Still no answer. The waitress finally set the pot down, her voice a little too brisk. "Not much to tell, sir." Folks moved on. She turned before he could respond, disappearing into the kitchen as if retreating from a flame. John sipped his coffee, tasted bitterness, not from the beans, but from the refusal around him. He finished his pie, placed money on the table, and left without pressing further. Outside, the bell jangled behind him, and as the door closed, conversation inside rose again, quieter but urgent. He felt eyes on his back as he crossed to the truck. Rex rose to meet him, ears tilted forward, body alert. John placed a hand on the dog's back. "We heard enough," he murmured. The ride back to the cabin traced the winding road through the forest. Afternoon light slanted between the oaks, painting the gravel with bands of gold and shadow. He tried to organize the responses he had witnessed the way silence itself had spoken louder than words. He thought of the sheriff's office and the librarian's careful warning. Now the diner had added another layer, an entire room of people choosing not to remember. That kind of silence did not grow by accident. It was cultivated, tended, and guarded. By the time he reached his drive, the sun had sunk low and the woods had shifted into their evening hush. He parked beneath the pines, Rex leaping lightly from the bed. The cabin stood calm, smoke from the stove venting faintly into the cool air. But as John climbed the porch steps, his stride slowed. Something glinted on the wooden table he had built years ago, a surface he had sanded smooth and oiled with his own hands. A knife stood there, buried to the hilt in the center of the grain, its handle of polished antler catching the last light. The blade quivered slightly as though it had only just been driven home. John stopped cold, every muscle tight. Rex growled low, his stance dropping as if ready for command. John's eyes swept the tree line, every shadow a potential shape. Nothing moved, but the message had already been delivered. He stepped closer, examining the knife. It was not factory-made, but hand-forged, a hunter's blade favored by men who knew the woods. The steel was honed, the balance deliberate. Whoever had placed it here had not come to steal or vandalize. They had come to declare knowledge. "We know you, we know where you live, and we can reach you." John pulled the knife free, the wood groaning around the wound. He weighed it in his hand, the heft certain, the threat unmistakable. He did not feel fear in that moment. He felt the cold return of an old readiness. He slid the knife into his belt and turned, scanning the perimeter again. The forest answered with nothing but its usual dusk sounds, but he knew enough to recognize the signs of surveillance. He led Rex inside, bolted the door, and lit the lamp. The cabin's warm light seemed thinner than usual, its comfort strained by intrusion. John placed the knife on the table beside his notebook and opened a new page. In careful print, he wrote, "Warning delivered. Town refuses to speak. Knife left his message." He circled the word message twice, then leaned back in his chair. The walls of silence around Harmony Creek were not passive, they were active and forced. He had tapped them with questions, and the town had answered not with words, but with steel. He poured water into Rex's bowl, then poured himself coffee, gone cold, the taste harsh but bracing. He stared out the window at the forest, its darkness pressing against the glass, and knew that the discovery of the truck had placed him inside a story others wanted buried. The question now was not whether he would pursue the truth, but how far those others were willing to go to stop him. The night after the knife had been left on his porch, John Carter slept lightly, if sleep was the right word at all. His body rested on the bed he had built from pine logs, but his mind stayed sharp, hovering in that half-state of alertness that years of service had carved into him. Rex lay at the door, his ears twitching at each shift in the wind, his chest rising slow and steady, but never surrendering to full rest. When dawn came gray and pale through the window, John swung his legs over the side of the bed and felt the familiar tightness in his shoulders that told him his instincts had been working all night. He dressed, laced his boots, and stepped onto the porch. The morning air was damp, carrying the scent of wet pine needles and the faint tang of ash from the cold fire pit. At first, the clearing looked as ordinary as ever, but years of patrol had taught him to see more than surface. He crouched near the edge of the porch where the soil met the first stretch of grass and studied the ground. The impressions were clear too deep to belong to deer or coyotes. They were boot prints, wide-soled, heavy-set in a pattern of deliberate pacing. Whoever had made them had circled the cabin more than once, their path a patient ring of surveillance. John followed the line, tracing each step as it looped around the woodpile, the rain barrel, and finally back toward the tree line. The prints had been pressed into the soil during the night, the edges still sharp. Whoever had been here had left only hours ago. He felt Rex's presence at his side, the dog's nose low to the ground, his body tense. John set his hand on the shepherd's back, feeling the muscle ready beneath the fur. "Not our imagination," he murmured. He straightened his eyes, lifting to the forest beyond. The woods were still, but stillness could hide more than noise. He spent the day working as usual, chopping kindling, repairing the gutter where storm debris had bent it. But every task was done with one eye on the trees. He left no tool out of place, no door unlatched. When dusk drew its long shadows across the clearing, he loaded his rifle, checked the lamp oil, and waited with the patience of a man who knew that pressure always reveals itself. The forest grew darker, and in the deep silence of evening, Rex stiffened, ears snapping forward, nose pointed toward the ridge. A sound too faint for human ears had reached him. He moved to the edge of the clearing, his body low, his growl rumbling. John lifted the rifle, his eyes scanning the dark line of the trees. At first he saw nothing. Then a flicker of movement, a figure slipping between trunks, shadow against shadow. The pace steady, practiced, deliberate. This was no hunter stumbling through the woods, no boy out past curfew. The gait was too precise, the balance too sure. John moved to the porch steps, his voice low but firm. "Rex, hold." The dog froze, quivering with the need to spring forward, but he obeyed. John's eyes followed the figure, trying to mark height, build, posture. The man moved with a discipline John recognized, the kind drilled by training rather than chance. He angled through the trees, never stepping on brush, his path calculated to mask noise. Then, as quickly as he appeared, he vanished, swallowed by the undergrowth. John advanced to the clearing's edge, rifle at the ready, Rex straining at his side. They moved a few yards in tracking the faint trail where moss had been disturbed, where a branch bent at an angle too clean to be natural. But the trail ended abruptly at a rocky patch where no footprint could take hold. The forest gave them nothing. Rex barked once, sharp and frustrated, then fell silent, his chest heaving. John lowered his rifle, the realization steadying in his chest. Whoever had been here was not a wanderer. He was a professional, someone who knew how to move unseen and how to leave without a trace. John led Rex back to the cabin, his mind calculating. The town's silence had not been passive. It had been enforced, and now enforcement had stepped from whispers into presence. The knife on the table had been the first message. The boots circling the cabin had been the second. The shadow in the woods had been the third, a warning written not in words, but in skill. Inside, John sat at his table and opened the notebook again. He wrote with care. Tracks around cabin. Professional observer. Evaded pursuit. Message clear. I am being watched. He drew a line beneath the words and leaned back in his chair. The lamp's glow lit the knife still lying on the wood, its blade catching the light like an eye that never closed. Rex settled near the door, his ears still alert, his gaze restless. John set his hand on the dog's back and let the silence stretch. He knew now that the story had shifted. What had been a hidden past was becoming an active present. Whoever had buried the truth 30 years ago had not let it rest, and whoever guarded it now would not hesitate to act again. The night deepened the woods, quieting to their slow rhythm, but John did not feel alone. He felt observed, measured, weighed. The game had changed, and he was no longer only the discoverer of a secret. He had become part of the story that others had fought to keep buried. The morning after the shadow in the forest vanished without a trace, John Carter sat at his oak table with the knife lying in front of him, like an accusation. His notebook already bore the weight of his observations, but writing could not quiet the restless beat of his mind. The night had left him with certainty. If he did not return to the armored truck soon, someone else might, and they would not hesitate to erase what he had uncovered. He packed his bag with rope gloves, flashlight, crowbar, and camera, then checked his rifle before sliding it back into the rack. Rex stood ready by the door, tail low, eyes bright with expectation. Together they drove the winding trail to the scarred ravine, the truck's engine humming steady against the silence of the woods. When John climbed down into the cut bank, the steel roof greeted him with its sullen red-brown rust, unchanged yet somehow heavier with the knowledge of being watched. He worked the crowbar into the hinge again and opened the heavy door just enough for him and Rex to slip inside. The air within the truck was foul, still tinged with the staleness of decay, but he forced himself to breathe shallow and focus. His flashlight beam cut across the skeletal remains in the cab, the rusted casings, the warped shotgun, all exactly as he had left them. But today he was not here to look at what had already spoken. He was here to find what had been hidden. He moved slowly, studying every seam of the armored floor, every rivet, every plate that might conceal more than it revealed. Years of service had taught him that vehicles built to carry money were designed with redundancies, compartments, and safes that were not always obvious to those without training. He knelt by the driver's seat, running his gloved hand across the base where steel met frame, and felt a faint ridge too straight to be accident, too deliberate to be natural wear. He tapped with the butt of his knife. The sound was different, hollow, where the rest was solid. His pulse quickened. He set down his pack, drew out the crowbar, and worked it into the seam. Rust groaned. Steel resisted, then gave with a muted snap as the hidden panel shifted. Beneath it lay a cavity about 2 feet square, its edges sealed with old rubber gaskets now crumbling under his touch. He peeled back the brittle remains and shone his light inside. At first he saw only dust and a scattering of mold, but then something caught the light, a small object wedged in the corner, tarnished yet unmistakable. He reached in and pulled out a lighter, the kind built to last a lifetime. Its silver body was dulled with age, its edges worn smooth by use, but the engraving still glimmered through the grime. The initials R.M. John turned it over in his hand, the weight more than metal. R.M. Robert Murphy, the deputy sheriff who, according to the library archives, had been the lead investigator on the armored truck disappearance in 1987. The coincidence was too sharp, too precise to be dismissed. A deputy tasked with finding the missing truck had left his lighter inside the very vehicle he was meant to uncover. Either he had been inside as an investigator, which records never mentioned, or he had been inside as a participant, which no official history had dared to suggest. John's grip tightened on the lighter, his breath steady but heavy with understanding. He photographed it from multiple angles, both in the cavity and in his hand, making sure the engraving was clear. He placed the lighter into a small evidence bag he carried, sealed it, and tucked it deep in his pack. Rex, watching from the doorway, growled low as though echoing the gravity of what his master had found. John replaced the panel, carefully brushing dirt back over its seams, making the cavity appear untouched. He closed the armored door and stepped out into the daylight, drawing fresh air into his lungs as if surfacing from deep water. Standing at the edge of the ravine, he considered the implications. If Murphy had been involved, then the silence of the town and the warnings at his cabin made sudden sense. A man who had once worn the badge might still hold influence even decades later. Wealth built from stolen millions could shape a community, buy silence and erase questions. Yet a single object, a silver lighter engraved with initials, could pierce the illusion. John climbed back to his truck, Rex bounding beside him. The woods seemed watchful again, but this time he felt less like prey and more like a witness carrying evidence that could not be denied. On the drive home, he rehearsed the paths ahead. Bring the lighter to the sheriff's office and risk it disappearing. Take it directly to state authorities and expose himself. Or dig deeper, gathering enough proof that no one could bury the truth again. When he reached the cabin, he set the lighter on the table beside the knife that had been left as a warning. 2 objects, 2 messages, one threatening him to stay silent, the other silently accusing a man of betrayal. He sat with his notebook and wrote, "Hidden compartment beneath driver's seat." Found silver lighter with initials R.M. Robert Murphy, lead investigator 1987. Connection undeniable. He underlined the word undeniable twice, then closed the book. Rex settled at his feet, head resting on his boot, eyes half closed but ears still tuned. John leaned back, listening to the slow breathing of the woods outside. The truth was no longer just speculation. It had form weight and proof, yet proof also carried danger. Whoever had left the knife on his porch would not let him keep it without resistance. He reached for the lighter again, feeling its cold surface against his palm, and realized that the object was not just a clue, but a key. It would either unlock the story long buried or lock him into a struggle he had not asked for. The night drew close, and the forest darkened beyond the windows. John extinguished the lamp, letting shadows claim the room. He sat in the quiet lighter in one hand, Rex's steady warmth at his side, and prepared himself for the truth to demand its price. The day after discovering the lighter, John Carter set out early, with Rex taking a narrow game trail that led deeper into the forest. He needed to clear his thoughts, to breathe the kind of air that comes only from solitude, but more importantly, he needed to test if the woods were still his, or if they now belonged to unseen eyes. The September sun filtered through the canopy, broken into sharp beams, and the ground smelled of pine sap and damp earth. John walked with his rifle slung but not forgotten, his senses tuned the way they had been in distant deserts and mountains. Rex trotted ahead, nose busy, tail low in concentration. They had traveled perhaps 2 miles from the cabin when John felt the air change, not in temperature, but in weight. He slowed, scanning the undergrowth. Rex froze ears, pricked a soft growl rising from his chest. From behind a stand of oaks, 2 men stepped into the path, each holding a pistol. Their clothing was plain work jackets and boots, but their eyes held no hesitation. One raised his weapon slightly. "You've been asking questions that don't need answers. he said, his voice flat and unyielding. The second added, "Best you forget what you saw in that ravine. Walk away, and this ends here." John's body remained still, but inside every instinct surged alive. He measured distance cover their stance, the tremor of fingers on triggers. He let his voice stay calm even. "You came a long way to tell me what I shouldn't know." Rex's growl deepened, his muscles coiled. The first man flicked his gun toward the dog. "Call him off." That was the moment John acted. He dropped sideways into the brush, pulling Rex with a sharp hand signal, and rolled behind a fallen log. The first shot cracked through the trees, splintering bark, but John was already moving, pushing Rex ahead through the undergrowth. Years of training took over. He shifted direction twice in quick succession, breaking line of sight, forcing the pursuers into hesitation. Rex darted ahead, leading through dense thickets where human pursuit would falter. The men cursed under their breath as they crashed after him, their movements too loud, too clumsy for true woodsmen. John circled wide, keeping low, then angled uphill toward a cluster of limestone outcrops. The second shot rang out closer but off mark. He slid behind stone, pressed his back to cool rock, and listened. The men were moving parallel, trying to flank him, their boots grinding against roots and stones. One voice rose above the noise, strained with frustration. "Murphy won't like it if we lose him." The name sliced through John's mind like a blade. Murphy, the initials on the lighter, the deputy-turned investigator, the one figure tied to both past and present. He filed the slip of tongue away, even as his body remained taut and ready. Rex crouched beside him, chest heaving but eyes bright, waiting for the next command. John scanned for options, spotted a break in the ridge where sunlight slanted through. He pointed, whispered, "Go," and Rex bounded forward, drawing attention with noise and speed. The men shouted, one firing toward the dog, but missing in haste. John used the distraction to slip opposite, moving silent along the rocks until he flanked them. He picked up a fist-sized stone and hurled it deep into the brush to his left. The crack of branches fooled one pursuer into firing, his attention dragged off. In that instant, John closed distance, rifle raised but barrel steady. "Enough," he said sharply. The men froze, weapons lowered but eyes still hard. He did not press further, knowing that pressing cornered animals leads to blood. Instead, he backed away, Rex rejoining him with a low growl. They withdrew into the forest, slipping into a ravine where shadows covered their path. The men did not follow. By the time John and Rex reached the dirt track leading home, his pulse had steadied, but his mind was ablaze. 2 armed strangers had risked revealing themselves just to warn him off. They had spoken with certainty, not like wanderers, but like men carrying orders, and in the heat of the chase one had let slip the name that connected everything Murphy. Back at the cabin, John sat at the table with the lighter in front of him, the knife still beside it, 2 objects now joined by the echo of a name. Rex lay at his feet, head on his paws, eyes watchful despite exhaustion. John opened his notebook and wrote in precise block letters, "2 armed men intercepted me in woods. Demanded silence. Attempted pursuit. Evaded." One spoke the name Murphy. He underlined it twice. The silence of the town was no longer abstract. It was armed, organized, and tied to a man whose initials had already condemned him. John closed the book, his jaw tight, his resolve steady. The forest outside was quiet again, but he no longer mistook that quiet for peace. It was the quiet of hunters waiting, and now he knew the name of the man who commanded them. Back at the cabin, John Carter sat with the notebook open and the lighter placed neatly in front of him. The initials engraved on its worn silver body stared at him as though demanding action. The slip of the tongue in the forest still rang in his ears, the pursuer's voice sharp and unguarded when he had shouted Murphy. The connection could no longer be ignored. John knew better than to walk into a sheriff's office with one piece of evidence and expect justice. He had served long enough to understand that power often lies in control of information, not the truth itself. He needed more than speculation, more than a name whispered in anger. He needed records, paper numbers, the kind of evidence that could not vanish when a file drawer closed. That night, under the cover of darkness, he unpacked the small satellite modem he kept for emergencies. Solitude demanded self-sufficiency, and though he avoided modern connections, he knew when to use them. The device hummed quietly as it sought the signal, the tablet's glow filling the cabin with a pale light. Rex lay beside him, ears pricked as though sensing the gravity of his master's search. John began with public archives starting with 1987. The news clippings were thin, a handful of articles about the armored truck disappearance before the coverage had suddenly gone silent. He already knew that story. What he wanted was what came after. He shifted to county records, searching property deeds, tax rolls, business licenses. At first, the name Robert Murphy appeared only as a deputy in minor mentions, routine citations, and community notices. But beginning in 1988, his presence shifted. A business license appeared, Murphy Development Incorporated. The following year, a deed for a tract of farmland just outside Harmony Creek. By 1991, multiple parcels in his name. By 1995, ownership of a sawmill and later a textile factory. The growth was not steady but explosive, the kind of expansion that no deputy's pension or savings could ever justify. John's eyes narrowed as he traced the timeline. The armored truck had vanished in late 1987. Within 18 months, Robert Murphy was no longer a deputy, but an entrepreneur whose reach stretched across the county. The pattern spoke for itself. Stolen millions had not disappeared into thin air. They had been laundered into land businesses and influence. Murphy had transformed blood money into legitimacy, building an empire that wrapped itself around Harmony Creek until silence was not just habit, but survival. John copied the documents, photographing each record on his tablet, building a file as carefully as he had once built case reports in combat zones. He organized deeds, tax receipts, and company filings into a chain, each link stronger than rumor or memory. And at the center of it all lay the silver lighter. He picked it up again, turning it over in his hand, tracing the letters with his thumb. RM. The engraving was not simply decoration. It was identity pressed into steel. Found in the hidden compartment of a truck, meant never to be seen again, it tied Murphy directly to the crime scene. It was not circumstantial. It was presence. No investigator could explain away why the lead deputy's personal lighter had been left inside a vehicle he was meant to recover. Combined with the sudden wealth, the pattern became not just suspicious, but damning. John leaned back, the weight of realization pressing into his chest. The town's silence, the diner's chill, the knife on his porch, the shadow in the woods, each piece now aligned under the name Murphy. The man was no longer a ghost of the past, but the architect of a present danger. Rex shifted closer, resting his chin on John's knee, a quiet anchor in the storm of revelation. John set his hand on the dog's head, drawing steadiness from the gesture. He returned to the notebook and wrote in measured strokes, Murphy Deputy in 1987. Lead investigator on disappearance. Within 1 year founded company. Within 3 purchased farmland. Within 5 factory owner. Current empire based on stolen funds. Lighter with initials RM recovered from hidden compartment, direct physical link to truck. He paused, then underlined the last words, direct physical link. The truth was no longer hidden in shadows. It stood exposed in the cold clarity of records and steel. Yet exposure alone meant nothing if it stayed within the cabin walls. Murphy had built 3 decades of power from silence, and silence could bury John as easily as it had buried the guards in that truck. He closed the notebook, extinguished the lamp, and sat in the darkness, listening to the steady breath of Rex and the deeper stillness of the woods outside. The forest no longer felt like refuge, but stage. He knew that with this knowledge there could be no return to solitude. Evidence had turned him into a threat, and threats invited pursuit. He slid the lighter into his pocket, its weight like a stone against his side, and whispered to the dog in the quiet, We know now, and so do they. John Carter knew the lighter in his pocket was more than metal and initials. It was leverage, but leverage only worked when applied in the right place. He had military patience, but patience alone would not stop a man like Murphy, who had already erased a crime from history and built an empire on silence. John had lived long enough to know institutions could be slow and sometimes compromised. He could not risk putting everything into the hands of officials who might quietly return the evidence to the very man it condemned. He needed light, and light came from exposure. That evening, he connected his satellite modem again and opened an encrypted email account. He had kept a small network of contacts from his years of service men and women who had gone on to fight corruption at home. Among them was Claire Donovan, an independent journalist known for pursuing stories no newspaper would touch until they could no longer be ignored. John remembered reading her work years earlier, reports that cut through the careful facades of wealthy men who thought themselves untouchable. He attached high-resolution photos of the lighter, its engraving clear, and the images of the hidden compartment in the armored truck. His message was brief, stripped of flourish, found in concealed compartment of missing Sterling Security armored truck from 1987. Initials RM. Match Robert Murphy, deputy on original case. Murphy's wealth and empire began within 1 year. Town silent threats received. This is proof. Act quickly. He hit send and shut down the modem, then leaned back in the chair. The silence of the cabin pressing close. Rex, stirred by the door ears twitching at a sound only he could hear, then settled again, his presence a steady reassurance. 2 days passed with only the rhythms of the forest to mark time. John split wood, checked his perimeter, and trained with Rex, all the while waiting for a response. On the third morning, he opened his device to find Claire's reply, received. Verified your images against public records. Story already in draft. Will publish within 24 hours. Be cautious. You have made yourself visible. John closed the message, his chest tightening. Visibility was both shield and target. When the article appeared online the following day, it spread faster than he expected. Claire's reputation carried weight, and the headline was sharp enough to cut through the layers of indifference. Former deputy linked to 1987 armored truck disappearance evidence emerges after decades. The photos of the lighter accompanied the text, its engraving undeniable. The article laid out the sudden rise of Murphy's empire, the silence of Harmony Creek, and the buried truth now clawing its way back into light. Comments multiplied, some skeptical, some furious, some demanding answers. The story was no longer John's alone. It belonged to anyone who read it. Yet exposure had a cost. That night, headlights cut across the distant ridge where no vehicle should have been. John watched from the dark porch as they appeared, paused, and disappeared again. It was no hunter's truck. Someone was probing the woods. By dawn, Rex growled at every shift of the wind. John packed his gear with precision loading extra ammunition ropes and supplies. He had stirred a hornet's nest, and the man at its center would not delegate this kind of crisis. Murphy had protected his secret for 30 years. He would not let it crumble without standing over the ruins himself. John left the cabin before noon, Rex trotting at his side, and followed the trail back to the ravine. The armored truck waited below, silent as a tomb, the door still scarred by his crowbar. He moved carefully, resetting the camouflage he had once placed, but this time he arranged it loosely, a deliberate imperfection. He wanted Murphy to come. He wanted him to believe he had found what he sought, even if the lighter was already gone. He took position on the ridge above where the pines gave him a clear line of sight into the gully. Rex lay flat beside him, silent, waiting. The woods stretched quiet, but John's instincts told him the stillness would not last. Late that night, when the moon hung low and pale, the silence cracked. 2 SUVs rolled slowly along the forgotten logging road, their engines muffled, but not enough to escape ears trained for intrusion. They stopped short of the ravine doors opening with deliberate caution. John raised his nightscope. He counted 3 men. 2 carried rifles scanning the tree line. The third man stepped forward, his coat long, his posture commanding even in shadow. The silver hair caught the moonlight. John's breath tightened. Robert Murphy had come himself. The old deputy-turned-businessman now stood where his crime had been buried, eyes fixed on the armored truck below. He gestured sharply, sending his men ahead, then followed every step heavy with urgency. John watched in silence, his finger light on the trigger, the weight of years collapsing into this moment. Murphy had come not as rumor or ghost, but as a man exposed by truth and dragged to the place he thought forgotten. The trap had been set, and the enemy had stepped inside. From the ridge above the ravine, John Carter watched Murphy descend toward the armored truck, his 2 armed men fanning out ahead of him with rifles raised. The night air was cool, the woods still, but the tension wrapped around the clearing like wire pulled taut. John lay motionless in the shadows. Rex pressed low against his side, the dog's ears pricked muscles vibrating with silent readiness. John's scope followed Murphy as the man reached the base of the ravine and stood before the door of the armored truck, its rusted hinges now symbols of the decades of silence he had forced upon the town. Murphy gestured impatiently at his men, ordering them to pry the door open further. The steel groaned as crowbars bit into seams John himself had once broken. The men worked quickly, their movements practiced but uneasy, as though the ground beneath them whispered of crimes long buried. Murphy leaned in his hand, brushing the doorframe, his silver hair glinting in the moonlight. John could see his face clearly now, drawn hardened and etched with fury, barely contained. Murphy spoke low, his voice carrying just enough for John to catch the tone of command. "Get everything out. Leave nothing." His men hesitated clearly, disturbed by the skeletal remains inside. Murphy stepped forward, shoving one aside, his voice rising. "Do it." Those men knew the risks. They knew too much. John's heart tightened. The words were not just commands, they were confessions. He adjusted his position rifle, steady breath controlled. He knew he needed Murphy's words to break the silence forever. Slowly, John rose from the ridge, letting his silhouette cut against the trees. "They didn't know you would kill them, did they?" He called down, his voice calm but sharp. All 3 men froze, rifles swinging upward. Murphy's eyes snapped to him, fury blazing. "Carter." He spat the name bitter on his tongue. "You don't belong here. You don't know what you're meddling with." John held his ground, his rifle unwavering. "I know enough. I know 2 guards trusted you. I know you promised them safety and then shot them in cold blood. I know you buried this truck and bought yourself a kingdom with blood money." Murphy's face twisted, his self-control breaking. His voice cracked as he shouted, "They were weak. They wanted more than their share. I gave them silence. I gave this town prosperity. Without me, Harmony Creek would have rotted like every other forgotten place in these hills. I built something out of nothing, and I'll be damned if I let you take it from me." His men shifted uneasily, but Murphy's eyes never left John. His hand slid inside his coat fingers, curling around the grip of a pistol. John steadied himself, every nerve taut, Rex growling deep and low, waiting for the signal. Murphy's voice dropped into a snarl. "You should have walked away, Marine. Now you'll join the others in the dirt." He drew the pistol, but before he could raise it, the forest erupted with light and sound. Floodlights snapped on, cutting the ravine into brilliance. Shouts echoed from every direction. Firm and commanding FBI. "Drop your weapons!" Figures in tactical vests moved like shadows with purpose. Rifles trained, boots pounding down the slope. Murphy's men froze, their weapons clattering to the ground as they raised their hands. Murphy staggered, his eyes wide in disbelief, the pistol still in his grip. John called out, his voice cold. "It's over, Murphy. You're finished." Agents swarmed around, seizing the gun from Murphy's hand, pulling his arms behind his back, snapping cold steel cuffs onto his wrists. Murphy's fury broke into a hoarse roar. You think you've won? This town needed me. They'll never turn against me. But his words rang hollow against the authority of the agents hauling him to his feet. One man stepped forward from the squad, removing his helmet. His face was weathered but steady, his eyes sharp with recognition. "John Carter," he said, his voice deep and familiar. John lowered his rifle slightly, a faint nod cutting across the space. "Good to see you again, Mark. Special Agent Mark Jensen, once his brother-in-arms in Kandahar, now a federal agent, gave a small grim smile. When I got your message, I knew it was real. You've always had a way of walking straight into the fire." John exhaled slowly, the weight of weeks pressing out of his chest. "And you've always had a way of pulling me back out." The two men exchanged a glance that needed no words, the kind born from nights when survival had hung on trust alone. Agents moved through the truck, photographing evidence, tagging the lighter John had already documented, marking the skeletal remains with solemn care. The ravine no longer felt like a tomb, but a courtroom under the open sky. Murphy, once untouchable, now stood shackled, his empire collapsing under the weight of truth. Rex pressed close to John's leg, the dog's steady warmth anchoring him as the chaos unfolded around them. John knelt, hand resting on the shepherd's strong shoulders. "We did it, boy," he whispered. Rex's tail thumped once against the ground, his eyes bright in the floodlights. As dawn began to gray, the horizon, the FBI convoy rolled out, carrying Murphy and his men toward justice. John remained a moment longer at the ridge, gazing at the armored truck, its rusted shell now a monument not to silence, but to endurance. The forest stirred with morning sounds, the darkness lifting. He knew his solitude in these woods could never return untouched, but perhaps peace did not mean forgetting the past. Perhaps it meant facing it, giving voice to the silenced and standing firm even when shadows pressed close. He turned toward the path home, Rex trotting faithfully beside him. The woods still held secrets, but for the first time in decades, one of its darkest had been brought into the light. Every story leaves behind questions, and now it's your turn. Press like, subscribe to the channel, and join the conversation in the comments. Which detail stayed with you the longest, and what do you think happens after this ending? Also, tell us where you're watching from. We'd love to know, too.